wealth and poverty, victory and defeat, nobility and baseness of birth. Good was defined as that which benefits. To confer benefit was no less essential to good than to impart warmth was to heat. If one asked in what to benefit lay, one received the reply that it lay in producing an act or state in accordance with virtue, and similarly it was laid down that to hurt lay in producing an act or state in accordance with vice. The indifference of things other than virtue and vice was apparent from the definition of good, which made it essentially beneficial. Such things as health and wealth might be beneficial or not, according to circumstances. They were, therefore, no more good than bad. Again, nothing could be really good, of which the good or ill depended on the use made of it, but this was the case with things like health and wealth. Good having been identified with virtue, there could be no question of any conflict between the right and the expedient. This was a point on which the Stoic doctrine was very explicit. The good was expedient, and fitting, and profitable, and useful, and serviceable, and beautiful, and beneficial, and choiceworthy, and just. These various predicates were defined, generally in accordance with their etymology, in such a way as to avoid the charge of one being a mere synonym of the other. Their contraries were all applicable to the bad. The true and only good, then, was identical with what the Greeks called the beautiful, and what we call the right. To say that a thing was right was to say that it was good, and conversely, to say that it was good was to say that it was right. This absolute identity between the good and right, and on the other hand between the bad and wrong, was the head and front of the Stoic ethics. The right contained in itself all that was necessary for the happy life. The wrong was the only evil, and made men miserable, whether they knew it or not. As virtue was itself the end, it was of course choiceworthy in and for itself, apart from hope or fear with regard to its consequences. Moreover, as being the highest good, it could admit of no increase from the addition of things indifferent. It did not even admit of increase from the prolongation of its own existence, for the question was not one of quantity but of quality. Virtue for an eternity was no more virtue, and therefore no more good, than virtue for a moment. Even so, one circle was no more round than another, whatever you might choose to make its diameter, nor would it detract from the perfection of a circle if it were to be obliterated immediately in the same dust in which it had been drawn. To say that the good of men lay in virtue was another way of saying that it lay in reason, since virtue was the perfection of reason. As reason was the only thing whereby nature had distinguished man from other creatures, to live the rational life was to follow nature. Nature was at once the law of God and the law for man. For by the nature of anything was meant, not that which we actually find it to be, but that which in the eternal fitness of things it was obviously intended to become. To be happy, then, was to be virtuous was to be rational was to follow nature, and to follow nature was to obey God. Virtue imparted to life that even flow in which Zeno declared happiness to consist. This was attained when one's own genius was in harmony with the will that disposed all things. Virtue, having been purified from all the dross of the emotions, came out as something purely intellectual, so that the Stoics agreed with the Socratic conception that virtue is knowledge. They also took on from Plato the 4 cardinal virtues of wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice, and defined them as so many branches of knowledge. Against these were set 4 cardinal vices of folly, intemperance, cowardice, and injustice. Under both the virtues and vices there was an elaborate classification of specific qualities. But notwithstanding the care with which the Stoics divided and subdivided the virtues, virtue, according to their doctrine, was all the time one and indivisible. For virtue was simply reason. and reason, if it were there, must control every department of conduct alike. He who has one virtue has all, was a paradox with which Greek thought was already familiar. But Chrysippus went beyond this, declaring that he who displayed one virtue did thereby display all. Neither was the man perfect who did not possess all the virtues, nor was the act perfect which did not involve them all. Where the virtues differed from one another was merely in the order in which they put things. Each was primarily itself, secondarily all the rest. Wisdom had to determine what it was right to do, but this involved the other virtues. Temperance had to impart stability to the impulses, but how could the term temperate be applied to a man who deserted his post through cowardice, or who failed to return a deposit through avarice, which is a form of injustice? Or yet to one who misconducted affairs through rashness, which falls under folly? Courage had to face dangers and difficulties, but it was not courage unless its cause were just. Indeed, one of the ways in which courage was defined was as virtue fighting on behalf of justice. Similarly, justice put first the assigning to each man his due, but in the act of doing so had to bring in the other virtues. In short, it was the business of the man of virtue to know and to do what ought to be done, for what ought to be done implied wisdom in choice, courage in endurance, justice in assignment, and temperance in abiding by one's conviction. One virtue never acted by itself, but always on the advice of a committee. The obverse to this paradox, he who has one vice has all vices, was a conclusion which the Stoics did not shrink from drawing. One might lose part of one's Corinthian ware and still retain the rest, but to lose one virtue, if virtue could be lost, would be to lose all along with it. We have now encountered the first paradox of Stoicism, and can discern its origin in the identification of virtue with pure reason. In setting forth the novelties in Zeno's teaching, Cicero mentions that, while his predecessors had recognized virtues due to nature and habit, he made all dependent upon reason. A natural consequence of this was the reassertion of the position which Plato held, or wished to hold, namely, that virtue can be taught. But the part played by nature in virtue cannot be ignored. It was not in the power of Zeno to alter facts. All he could do was to legislate as to names. And this he did vigorously. Nothing was to be called virtue which was not of the nature of reason and knowledge, but still it had to be admitted that nature supplied the starting points for the four cardinal virtues, for the discovery of one's duty, and the steadying of one's impulses, for right endurances and harmonious distributions. To nature were due the seeds, though the harvest was reaped by the sage. Hers were the sparks, though the fire was to be fanned into flame by teaching. From things good and bad we now turn to things indifferent. Hitherto the Stoic doctrine has been stern and uncompromising. We have now to look at it under a different aspect, and to see how it tried to conciliate common sense. By things indifferent were meant such as did not necessarily contribute to virtue, for instance, health, wealth, strength, and honor. It is possible to have all these and not be virtuous. It is possible also to be virtuous without them. But we have now to learn that, though these things are neither good nor evil, and are therefore not matter for choice or avoidance, they are far from being indifferent in the sense of arousing neither impulse nor repulsion. There are things, indeed, that are indifferent in the latter sense, such as whether you put out your finger this way or that, whether you stoop to pick up a straw or not, whether the number of hairs on your head be odd or even. But things of this sort are exceptional. The bulk of things other than virtue and vice do arouse in us either impulse or repulsion. Let it be understood, then, that there are two senses of the word indifferent: 1, neither good nor bad; 2, neither awaking impulse nor repulsion. Among things indifferent in the former sense, some were in accordance with nature, some were contrary to nature, and some were neither one nor the other.